I'm 84, and I've been growing comfrey in the back corner of this garden since 1987, right next to the spot where Eleanor used to hang the dish towels on the line to dry. Last spring, my doctor looked at my chart, looked at my hands, and asked what I'd been putting on them at night. I told him. He set his pen down and said, "Arthur, I'd stop that if I were you." Just like that. No explanation offered. No question about whether it was helping. Just stop it. I've written some of this down already. It's in the Coleman Remedy book. The link is in the description. But what I want to tell you today starts long before that book. Starts back in Harlan County, Kentucky, when I was 10 years old, and my daddy showed me the difference between the weeds you pull and the ones you leave alone. If you've ever been told to stop something that was working for you by someone who never once asked why you started, stay with me a while. I think you might find something familiar here. Hit subscribe if you're new, and leave me a comment below. Tell me if a doctor ever warned you away from something your grandmother would have kept right on doing without a second thought. I read every single comment, every one. My father's name was Earl Coleman. He worked the coal mines in Harlan County and then spent the back half of his life farming the same ground he'd spent the first half trying to leave. He had a 6th grade education by any official measure, and hands that looked like they'd been carved from something older than wood. But he kept a notebook, not a journal, a remedy book, dark brown cloth cover, hand-bound, pages gone soft at the corners from decades of handling. He wrote down everything his grandmother had taught him about plants, which ones healed what, how to prepare them, how much was enough, and how much was past enough. He wrote it in small, careful handwriting, like a man who understood that the things worth saying didn't need extra room. I still have that notebook. It sits here on my kitchen table, right to my left, the same place it sat since he pressed it into my hands in 1982 and said, quiet and certain, "Don't lose this, Arthur." Comfrey had 3 full pages in that notebook. He called it Knitbone. His grandmother called it that before him. It's an old Appalachian name for an old Appalachian plant. Leaves wide as your outstretched hand, roots that go deep and come back every spring without any invitation. My daddy wrote about the poultice from the leaves for bruising and swelling, the salve from the root for joint pain, and, I want you to notice this, at the top of the first Comfrey page, underlined twice in his exact handwriting, does not go inside the body, goes on the outside only. This is important. My father knew. I just didn't understand yet why he felt the need to write it down quite that way. I started making the comfrey root salve sometime around 2011. My arthritis had gotten to a particular kind of steady unpleasantness. The first hour after waking, trying to close my fingers, the knuckles stiff and burning, like something mechanical had seized overnight. The workshop tools I'd used since I was 18 years old suddenly required a deliberate, effortful grip that they hadn't required before. I didn't want another prescription. I'd been through that after the heart attack in 2009, and I knew the difference between managing a problem and actually trying to solve it. So I went to my father's notebook, found the comfrey pages, made the salve the way he'd written it, then added beeswax. Eleanor had found the recipe years before and penciled in a better ratio in the margin, in her small nurse's handwriting, with a note beside it that said, "Smoother this way." I used her version. Every night before sleep, working it slowly into the joints of both hands, until the skin went warm and the stiffness began to loosen its grip. Within 3 weeks, the morning pain had changed, not disappeared, but pulled back from the worst of itself. I could close my fist in the first 10 minutes of being awake. That sounds like a small thing. It was not a small thing to me. I kept using it, month after month, year after year, the same quiet routine. It cost me almost nothing. The comfrey grows right there in the garden, comes back every spring on its own terms. $1 or $2 per batch at most, and it worked. For more than a decade, it worked without complaint and without fanfare. I never questioned it. Why would I? My hands still functioned. I could still press seeds into the soil at 5:30 in the morning, still hold a chisel with some authority, still do the things that make a day feel like it belongs to you. That was enough. That was exactly enough. And then last spring, I went in for a routine blood pressure check, and on the way out, almost as an afterthought, the doctor looked at my hands and asked. I put the comfrey salve on the workshop shelf that same afternoon. Not in the trash, on the shelf. There is a difference, and I knew it, even then. I wasn't prepared to throw away something my father had written 3 careful pages about. But I was raised to respect what I didn't yet fully understand. And I didn't yet have the full picture. The first week without it, my hands were fine. The second week, the stiffness began coming back at the edges. Cautious at first, the way cold weather tests a window frame in early October, before it decides to settle in through the winter. By the 4th week, the first hour after waking, was what it had been in 2010. That slow, tight grinding in the knuckles, the fingers reluctant, the particular kind of pain that doesn't announce itself loudly. It just sits there, reliable as a bad habit, reminding you. I sat at the kitchen table with my father's notebook open in front of me and my coffee going cold beside it. I just thought. That's all I did for a while. From every angle, slowly, without rushing toward a conclusion. That kind of thinking is not comfortable at 84. You'd think by now I'd have made peace with not knowing things. But there is a particular unease in sitting with a remedy your father trusted, that your wife improved with her own knowledge, that worked without interruption for over a decade, and genuinely not knowing whether all of it had simply been wrong. Eleanor used to say, she said it more than once, usually when I was dug in about something without enough evidence to justify it. She'd say, "Arthur, the question isn't whether you're right. The question is whether you've been thorough." 28 years of nursing gave her that. She had watched more people be wrong with tremendous confidence than most people see in a lifetime. She never made me feel small for needing to hear it. I had not been thorough. I had been obedient to a doctor's opinion without doing what any decent engineer would do first. Go back to the source. Read the actual material. Find out exactly what the concern was, and under exactly what conditions it applied. Those are not the same thing as the concern itself. My neighbor Carl came by that week to return a bar clamp he'd borrowed from the workshop. He found me at the table with the notebook and a stack of papers I'd printed at the library computer. Carl grows tomatoes that have no business being as good as they are, and he doesn't talk more than a situation requires. He looked at the table, the notebook, the papers, the cold coffee, and said simply, "You look like a man trying to prove himself wrong." Then he set the clamp on the workbench and walked back out. He wasn't reaching for wisdom. That's just Carl. But he was right, and hearing it said plainly was what I needed. I've written down everything I found in that research, the specific compound involved, the specific context in which the concern is valid, and the preparation method I use today, exactly as my father specified it. It's all in the Coleman Remedy book. There's a full section on what belongs on the skin and what should never cross into the body. And Comfrey gets its own entry with the measurements from my father's notebook and the adjustments Eleanor wrote in the margins over the years. The link is in the description if you want to read it at your own pace. But let me tell you what I actually found, because it changes the picture considerably. The plant is not the problem. I want to say that first, plainly, before anything else. Comfrey contains compounds called pyrrolizidine alkaloids. Write that down. In sufficient quantity, taken internally, over a prolonged period, they can be hard on the liver. That is real. That is documented. The concern my doctor mentioned is not invented, but here is what my father wrote in 1954 at the top of the first Comfrey page, underlined twice, with no chemistry degree and no access to any pharmaceutical journal. Does not go inside the body, goes on the outside only. He knew, not in the language those researchers would eventually use, not with the compound names or the cellular mechanisms. He had the practical knowledge that actually matters, what the plant did when you used it correctly, and what could happen when you didn't. He'd gotten it from his grandmother, and she from hers, and somewhere along that line, someone learned it the hard way and made sure the next person wouldn't have to. That's how that tradition worked, not guesswork. Accumulated consequence, written down carefully. The topical use, skin only, the salve and the poultice, has a different picture entirely. There is research on it, including a clinical study I found in a German medical journal examining comfrey root extract for joint and back pain. External application only. The results were favorable enough that the researchers recommended continued study. My doctor had not been wrong to mention concerns. The concerns exist. What the appointment hadn't had room for was the distinction between what my father had always warned against and what the warnings actually applied to. That distinction is the entire story, and I had nearly thrown away something that worked because nobody had time to finish the sentence. I understood all of this at 11:30 on a Tuesday night at my kitchen table, reading glasses fogging from the coffee, my father's notebook lying open next to the printed papers. When it finally settled into place, when I had the complete picture my training had always demanded, what I felt first was relief. Plain, uncomplicated relief. And then something quieter than relief. The quiet thing was for my father, not the grief that announces itself with ceremony. The other kind, the slow, settling kind, that comes when you understand how much a man knew that was never written down anywhere official, how much a coal miner from Harlan County understood about the plants around him, and how close all of that understanding came to being lost when he died in 1989. How it had survived only because he had the patience to fill a notebook carefully and the foresight to press it into his son's hands. How close it comes to being lost every day, with every generation that doesn't bother to write things down. I went out to the garden that evening. It was past 10, the air cool and damp, the particular quiet you get in Asheville when the rest of the world has finally stopped making noise. I stood beside the comfrey plants for a while. I could smell the soil and the faint green smell of the leaves and the stillness of the garden at that hour. I thought about my father standing next to plants like these, his grandmother standing next to plants like these, and what they had figured out between them, being right enough and specific enough and carefully enough recorded that it had traveled all the way to me, through a hand-bound notebook, through 60 years, through a medical appointment that very nearly ended it. That is not a small thing. The comfrey salve is back on my nightstand. I use it the way my father specified, on the skin, on the joints, worked in slowly before sleep. Not in tea, not in anything that goes past the surface. The way it was always meant to be used in this family, by people who had thought carefully about what they were doing and written down what they learned. My hands are not cured. I want to be honest about that, because I'm not in the business of claiming more than I can stand behind. These are 84-year-old hands that have been in soil and machine oil and sawdust for 60 years. Nothing was ever going to cure them. But they're working. The mornings are mine again. I can hold a chisel. That is the exact sum of what I ever asked for. I didn't call my doctor to tell him what I'd found. He is a decent man with a full waiting room and a way of understanding the world that took years to build, and I have no interest in arguing with it. I just needed to be thorough, the way Eleanor always said to be. Once I was, I could make my own decision. That's what I'd like you to sit with, if you take nothing else from today. Not the comfrey, not the salve or the notebook, or any of the specifics. Just this. The people who tell you to stop something rarely ask why you started. And sometimes, not always, but sometimes, the reason you started is where everything important is hiding. At 84, I don't have time for things that don't work. I also don't have time to abandon things that do work because someone used the word concerns and didn't finish the sentence. I've written it all down, everything in my father's notebook, organized with measurements and preparation notes and the specific margin corrections Eleanor made over the years. Everything I've researched in the years since she passed. Sitting at this table in a house that has more quiet in it than I'd like. All the things I want my grandchildren to have, before any of it disappears, the way things disappear when the people who hold them are gone. I called it the Coleman Remedy Book. It is not a medical document. I'm not a doctor and I have never pretended to be one. It's what one stubborn man from Harlan County figured out, with help from people who are no longer here, but whose knowledge doesn't have to go with them. The link is in the description. Read it the way you'd read a letter left on a kitchen table. Not looking for a prescription, looking for company. My daddy used to say the most valuable things in a house are almost never the ones that cost the most. He meant furniture. But I have found it to be true of nearly everything in 84 years of paying attention. The comfrey in my garden costs me nothing. It returns every spring without being asked. The knowledge of how to use it, the careful, specific knowledge of what works and why, and under what exact conditions. That came from a man with a 6th grade education who thought what he knew was worth keeping. He was right to think so.